Welcome back to Biology 104. Today we're going to be talking about snails, shells, and octopus tails, which is going to be our notes on the mollusk. So for this, we're going to have 6 classes that we're going to look at. The first one is Monoplacophora, and the next one is Polyplacophora. And one thing that's helpful is if you learn the name, like why it's named what it's named, then you can remember the differences between the 6 classes of mollusca that we're going to look at. So the phylum would be Mollusca, and then these are the 6 classes. So for example, that first one, Monoplacophora, mono means one, placo means plate, and phora means to carry something. So Monoplacophora would be to carry one plate. And they have this one plate on their body, or this one shell, Monoplacophora. The next one, you have Polyplacophora. Poly means many, so carrying many plates. And if you look at it there, you'll see all these different plates that Polyplacophora has. Bivalvia, you could probably guess what that would be. Bi is two. Valva means a folding door or a valve. And bivalvia has 2 valves, or 2 halves that close together. Scaphopoda, scaphe is the Greek for boat, and podos is foot. So Scaphopoda would be a boat foot, basically. And that's what it looks like. It looks like a boat with a foot, or feet, hanging off the bottom of it. The next one, Cephalopoda. Kephale means head in Greek, and then podos would be foot again, so it's head foot. And if you look at it, it has a head for a foot, essentially, if you look at its position. So the next one would be Gastropoda. Gaster would be stomach or gastric, and then podos would be foot again, so this would be belly-footed. And if you look at it, that's also a good name for that type of organism. So for the classification, domain is going to be Eukarya, kingdom is Animalia, and the phylum will be Mollusca. And there are 90,000 different species of mollusk. So we're obviously not going to look at that. We're just going to look at the 6 classes and then kind of describe the differences between those classes. We've mentioned this term before, and we'll mention it again, which is the Lophotrochozoa. And that is a large group of many different organismal classes. And what that means, Lophotrochozoa, the lophophore is something that some organisms have, and a trochophore is something that other organisms have. And if an organism has either one of those, it fits into the Lophotrochozoa. And basically those are different types of larvae that they can have, or different types of feeding tentacles that an organism might have. And if it has one of the two, it's going to fit into Lophotrochozoa. Some other organisms that are in this large clade would be the annelids, like earthworms, and also flatworms, like platyhelminths, and organisms like that. So again, that's the general structure. If you remember the name, then you can remember what they are. So that's one thing that helps with learning sort of the prefixes and the roots of those words. So what are they going to have? What are the characteristics of mollusca? They're going to have bilateral symmetry, which means if you split it, facing it, you split it down the middle, it's going to have 2 even sides, mirror images of each other. Going to be collimates, so they're going to have a true body cavity. Their common body plan will involve in some way a head, a foot, and what we call a visceral mass. They're all going to fit into this in some way. Now, it might be different. They might be modified in different ways, but they're going to have those basic parts. The muscular foot is mostly going to be used for movement. But again, you'll see that in different ways in different animals. The dorsal body wall forms the mantle, which encloses the mantle cavity, and the mantle secretes the shell. And we'll talk about what that looks like. And then gaseous exchange for respiration is going to be through gills or for lungs. They're going to have complex digestive systems. containing something called a radula, which is it's a mouth part with all these little teeth structures that allow them to basically chew their food, essentially. It's a little bit different. We'll look at what that looks like, but it's pronounced radula, and the phonology of that is similar to like educate, how it has that J sound. It's radula with that J sound. You're going to have a nervous system, very well developed senses, particularly in the head. Some of these are very advanced animals, which is pretty cool. Open circulatory system. They're going to have a heart, some vascularization. Blood's going to flow into the body. Cephalopods will mostly have a closed circulatory system. And then they'll have one or two kidneys, which is called metanephridia, is how you say that. So this is what that body plan looks like. And again, this would be a gastropod or gastropoda. Gastro for stomach, poda or poda for foot. So it's the belly foot. And if you look at where their belly would be, that is the muscular foot of the animal. You'll see the mantle here and the shell. And the mantle is going to secrete those compounds and organic compounds that are going to make up that hard shell. And really the shell is mostly, if you think of chalk is like natural chalk is just calcium carbonate. 95% of the shell of these organisms is also calcium carbonate, which is produced by the mantle and released, but the other 5% is organic compounds, and those compounds is what makes it actually have that really strong structure to it. Without that, it would be very, very brittle. So that's what gives it its super strength. There's that radula there. You can see it in the top left for a sea slug. You're going to see a beak in some of these organisms. But the radula basically is this serrated teeth. And the word radula comes from a Latin word, radere, which means to scrape. And when these organisms eat, it's basically like scraping the food into its stomach and kind of grinds it into smaller and smaller pieces. So our class, Monoplacophora, one of the examples for this, and the only example that we have right now, would be the Neopelina galatheae, is the genus species name. And this group is the only living species in this class. So we consider it to be a living fossil. And for a long time, they thought this class of organisms was just completely extinct. But then they actually discovered this one, and that's actually where its name comes from. The Galathea 2 was an expedition, a deep sea expedition, where they actually discovered this species. And it was a huge event because they thought that these were only alive, or not alive, but only found in the fossil record, and that there would be no extant organisms. But then they found this one, so they named it after that expedition, which is pretty cool. The next class would be the Polyplacophora. And again, thinking about these names, Monoplacophora, one plate. As you can see there, it's one plate. And then the next class, Polyplacophora, would be many plates. And these are also called the chitons. And if you look at these organisms, you see many plates running across the back there. They're also called sea cradles. And if you look at them, if you just tilt it over, it looks like a little cradle for a baby. And if you look under the base there, you'll see it still has that muscular foot and mouth and the mantle. So they're all going to have the similar body plan. They're just modified in different ways. You can see there in the top right how small they are. They fit into a very small place. And these are going to be exclusively marine. And there's what that muscular foot looks like under the belly there. The next class is Scaphopoda. Scaphopoda, they have these tooth shell or tusk shell to them. You see it looks like a curve, and scaphe in Greek means a boat, and it looks like a boat. And then pod or poda means foot, so it looks like a boat with feet coming out of the bottom. So what they do is they use that tubular shell for burrowing into the ground, of the sea floor. And then they can use that to actually respire through the opening in the tube as it comes out of the sand or whatever they're in the sediment layer there. And then they can, retract all the way in to avoid predators, as you see there in the bottom left image. So that larger opening, that's where the animal's feet, or muscular foot rather, would extend down to anchor the animal. So it can adjust, its depth into the sea floor, which is pretty neat. Our next class would be the Gastropoda. This would be the snails, slugs, whelks, conches, and nudibranches. So these organisms, the Gastropoda, they are described as univalves. Uni meaning one, so these are one-piece shells. And that's what you see there in the images. They exhibit something really interesting called torsion, where basically their body plan reverses itself. As it develops, the mantle, the visceral mass, and the shell, they rotate 180 degrees. And we'll talk about why that happens here in a second, but that's something really interesting about these gastropods. And if you remember the conch from the Lord of the Flies, that would be in this group of animals in this class. And in Lord of the Flies, if you had the conch, then you were allowed to speak. So that would be one of these groups in here. So this would be the snail. We'll just show you some pictures of each, and then we'll talk about them. The slugs would be in this class. Whelks and conches. So the difference between those two, you might not be able to tell the difference, but whelks are carnivores, and they live in cool water. They have a more elongated shell, and the conches, they're herbivores, and they're going to be in warmer tropical waters, and their shells are a little bit wider, and they have a flared lip, usually described as like a triangular or a more triangular shape. They're both kind of triangular. But that is the difference in a whelks and a conch. Then the nudibranches, which are the sea slugs, and they have super beautiful color displays. So for the Gastropoda, again, they're univalves, so they have a one-piece shell. Not all of the organisms have that, but that is a general characteristic that you're going to see. The end of the shell is called the apex, or the peak. And as the animal grows, the whorls that you see are going to actually increase in size. So there's what that shell looks like. It is coiled, and for these organisms, it shifts to one side. If it shifts to the right side, we call that dextral. And if it shifts to the left side, we call that sinistral. And that's what you see there in the image. So then to go back to that torsion concept that we mentioned. So for torsion, that would be an anatomical event which takes place in the early part of the life of a snail and slug. Torsion is the rotation of the visceral mass, mantle, and shell 180 degrees with respect to the head and foot of the gastropod. So this brings the mantle cavity and the anus from the posterior position to an anterior position above the head, which seems like a huge disadvantage. Now, another thing that happens is once that torsion occurs, the organs are no longer symmetrical, and the rotation makes the bilateral symmetry, it takes it away. So it's no longer bilaterally symmetric, which is also a disadvantage. So it pushes the anus above the head, which means you're going to get risk of infection, especially in the lungs and the mouth and the food that it's going to eat. And then also you lose bilateral symmetry. So why would this organism do this? What is the actual benefit of this? Well, one thing is that if it engages with a predator, if the mantle cavity is in the posterior position before torsion, well, then the head cannot actually retract into the mantle cavity. The foot could, part of the foot, but the head would not be able to. But after torsion, you see the mantle cavity is in the anterior position where the head is. So if a predator comes after torsion, the head can retract into the mantle cavity. So that's really the greatest benefit. There are other benefits, but that's the main thing. And to prevent the problems that would come from having the anus so close to the head, there are some different siphoning organs or channels that help pull away the defecation so that it does not get into the mouth and the gills. So it does have adaptations to prevent problems from this. And then some organisms have adapted to just not do torsion, to do what's called detorsion, so that they don't have that problem. But anyway, that's what it looks like. You'll see the pathway from the mouth to the anus as it curls around and then ends up facing towards the head. A really interesting developmental stage there. So for the gastropoda, the shell opening is called the aperture. Think about like a camera. Cameras have an aperture that open up to let light in. And the opening of the shell is also called the aperture. It may or may not be covered, and if it is, that valve that covers the aperture is called the operculum. As far as how they eat, you'll see herbivores, scavenging, and carnivores, carnivorous behavior in these gastropods. For our next class, we have the bivalvia, so 2 valves. This is going to be your mussels, clams, scallops, oysters, and shipworms, which are really interesting. They have 2 shells, and they're connected by a hinge. The muscles that close that hinge are called the adductor muscles. And if you've taken anatomy, to do adduction is to use your muscles to bring your arms and legs closer to your midline. And that's what's happening here. They're adductor muscles because they close the clamshell. The oldest part of the shell is called the umbo, or the large hump. They're going to be sedentary filter feeders. So they have in-current and ex-current siphons, and they bring in water, hoping to catch food particles in that, catch it on their gills, and then they can start to digest and absorb those nutrients. And then the water and waste moves out through the ex-current siphon. And they can also use that, moving in that water and oxygen for respiration. They lack a head and a radula. So for the bivalves, one of these that's really interesting. We think of clams and oysters, but something interesting is called a shipworm. For these organisms, the reason they're called this is because they burrow into wood. So if there's a shipwreck, and all that wood sinks to the bottom of the ocean, then these shipworms will bore little holes into it and live in there. So the 2 white shells that you see there on the shipworm, that is the bivalvia. That is the 2 valves of the organisms. And it uses that to grind into the wood. So then the long fleshy body is what extends deep into the tunnel that it creates. So it's all the same body structures. They've just been heavily modified for its purpose there. So then you see the structure here. You've got the umbo, and then going out from the oldest part is all these growth lines. And the growth lines come as it moves through these growing cycles. Now it's not like, well, I guess it is similar, because even with trees you can get multiple growth lines if you have multiple growing seasons in a year. And with these organisms, you could have anywhere from no growth line in a given year to 4 perhaps in a given year. So it really just depends. If you count, for example, let's say it has 10 lines, the actual age, because they usually produce more than 1 line per year normally, it's probably going to be about 6 years old. So if you have, and you'll find these, we dissected one in our lab, it was like 140 growth lines. So let's say it had 100, then it would probably be around 60, maybe 50 to 80 years old, which is pretty cool. So 140, it might be 100 years old. And some of these, there was one that was discovered, and it was over 400 years old. So they can live a really, really long time. And this is what the internal structure of these bivalves looks like. In this case, it has these external gills and these adductor muscles that help it close. And then it's going to have all these other structures, in-current, ex-current siphons for moving that fluid through. They have 3 shell layers, the periostracum, the prismatic layer, and the nacreous layer. The periostracum is the horned outer layer. The prismatic layer is a calcium carbonate layer. That's like that chalky substance we talked about. and then the nacre or the nacreous layer. And the nacreous layer is pretty interesting. It's shiny, it's iridescent really in the color that it has. And what it does is it produces something called nacre. What nacre does is it creates a lining so that the soft tissues are protected from that rough calcium carbonate. So none of those soft tissues and organs get scratched or damaged or irritated. So it's a good sort of bridge layer in between. It also provides protection, like if a little organism gets into the bivalve, it'll actually release, the nacreous layer will release nacre that will cover that little particle, organism, or whatever, and it will protect it. It'll neutralize whatever threat that was. Maybe it's a parasite, for example. Now for clams, they're not going to produce pearls very often. It's estimated that you'll only find a pearl in about 1 in 10,000 clams. But for oysters, it's much more common. For the clam pearls, they're usually like a really weird shape. So it's not something that would be put into jewelry. They're also extremely rare. It's probably going to be a little bit more expensive. And they go for around anywhere from like $100 to $500, depending on the species it came from and what it looks like and how large it is. So for reproduction, they're going to have sexual reproduction. So there will be male and female bivalves. And they're going to produce sperm and egg that will reach each other in the external environment, in the aqueous environment. Sperm fertilizes the egg, and then it's going to form a larva. And then there are 3 larval stages, actually. In its growth cycle after that, it'll be the trochophore, which is the first stage. It's just a little ciliated larvae, so it can swim through the water. And then you'll get the veliger larva, which has a shell and something called a velum, which is another structure that helps it swim. And then its third stage of larval development, it actually develops a shell. And its foot will be used to allow it to crawl over the subfloor, or the floor of the ocean floor. And then it will become a juvenile clam and then an adult clam. So it has a long sort of developmental process there. So for our class Cephalopoda, think cephalic, which would be a head. This would be the octopus, cuttlefish, nautilus, and the squid. These are the most complex mollusks in the phylum Mollusca. They are all marine, and they are all predatorial. They do have a modified radula, which is called a beak. And its foot is modified into its tentacles and arms, which we'll look at. So for the cephalopoda shell, depending on the organism, it's going to be used in different ways. So for example, in the squid, the shell is modified into an internal structure, and they call it an internal pin. And we'll look at the benefits of that. In an octopus, it has no shell at all, so it just loses its shell. And in the nautilus, it has a chamber that holds a gas, and that allows it to adjust its buoyancy or level in the water. In cuttlefish, they actually have a small curved bone that is called a cuttle bone, which is where they get that name from. So for example, with the squid, you'll see it has this pin in its region here. And what that does is it provides an anchor point for all of the muscles to attach. So without that, the muscles wouldn't have any leverage from which to pull from something. It also holds its shape really well. And since it's internal, it doesn't create drag in the water. So it moves through the water extremely smoothly while also having the benefits of what is functioning as an internal skeletal structure, which is pretty cool. So for the cephalopoda movement, they use a siphon for locomotion, and that allows them to propel themselves in many different directions. Some of them also produce ink, and they call that sepia, which is a smoke screen, and that can be used for several different things. It's not just to, disguise themselves or prevent a predator from being able to see them, but it also has chemicals in it that will actually deter the predator's ability to be able to smell the animal. It messes with their senses as well, which is pretty cool. So for reproduction in cephalopods, what they're going to have is they have these beautiful colors, these chromatophores. And they use this, as you see, this kind of iridescent color changes over its body. And that's going to be used for courtship displays. And it's actually the males that will have these beautiful color spreads over their bodies. And they'll use that to swim in the water and attract a female. It's also been thought that this deters other males from being where they are. Having these colors signifies dominance and over that territory, over that female that it's trying to court. And the other males will be able to recognize that visually and then avoid having some kind of, fight with that cephalopod over that female. So for their extensions, for the modifications of the foot, we're going to see different things in each of these organisms. For the squid, they're going to have 10, 2 tentacles, 8 arms. The nautilus could have 60 to 90 tentacles, but they lack suckers. The cuttlefish, similar to the squid, is going to have 10, 2 tentacles, and 8 arms. And then the octopus, octa for 8, is going to have 8 arms. So for the chambered nautilus, again, you see all these different tentacles, can have up to 90 of them, but they're going to lack the suckers. And for the shell of these, it has a gas chamber that is used for the buoyancy of the organism, which is pretty cool. Very unique. And then for the squid, again, it has 10. It's going to be 2 tentacles, 8 arms, and the shell is modified into an internal pin, which you can't see, but would be in the organism there for anchoring of the muscles. Then we have the octopus, which has 8 arms. It does have suckers, and it just completely loses its shell. That's why you see the shape of it as it moves is just super flexible because it has no shell for anchoring of anything. And then the cuttlefish, and again, it's called a cuttlefish, C-U-T-T-L-E, because it possesses this internal chambered shell, which they call a cuttle bone. And that also allows it to adjust its buoyancy in the water. And it would have 10 extensions of the foot, 2 tentacles, and 8 arms. Some cool facts about these organisms would be the giant and colossal squids. For this, I'll just read you this little fact here. It says the giant squid and colossal squid are the largest invertebrates known. The largest specimen weighed 275 kilograms, and a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So, well over 550 pounds would be the weight of that organism. And you can see in this image a person swimming beside these. Imagine if something like that swam up next to you, how terrifying that would be. If you look at a colossal squid, 495 kilograms, so that would be over 1,000 pounds in weight. And they're also extremely long. And you might have one 15 meters, so about 45 feet long, if you can imagine how gigantic that would be. So again, the ink that's produced, it's not just for, camouflage, hiding itself and escaping. It also sends signals to other squids and octopuses to avoid that area. So it's an alarm signal, it camouflage, disguise, and it deceives their senses so they can't find their prey. And then the last image I'll show you here is just that nacreous layer has come over some type of parasite or something that tried to get into the bivalve, and then you get all of those pearls. In oysters, they're going to be more round like this, and in clams, they're usually going to be kind of more amorphous. So anyway, that is the phylum Mollusca notes. Thank you for listening.